And so this question of how to maintain high morale and fighting spirit in this very cold winter, the French army's not really equipped for it because everybody thought the war would be over quite quickly, becomes paramount. And there is this confluence of circumstances that leads to the army-wide adoption of a wine ration. So there's about 2.75 million soldiers in the French army on the Western Front. So everybody's getting a quarter liter of wine per man per day. It goes up to, in mid-1915, to half a liter. And in October 1917, towards the end of the war, to 3/4 of a liter per man per day. So a full bottle.
What are the implications of an intoxicated army? Today we're going to hear from Adam Zientek, a historian whose book on the French Army's use of wine during World War I opened up new questions about what it means for a government to chemically modify the behavior of its fighting force. Stay tuned. Let's talk about war and wine in the First World War in particular. You've uncovered something that I think is it blew my mind in a couple different directions, like the relationship with particularly the French army and wine. Can you talk a little bit about the history and how you came about this whole discovery?
Well, basically, in my third year of graduate school, I had a kind of crisis in that I found out that my proposed dissertation topic, which had to do with the French-Algerian War, was basically impossible to do. So I was struggling to find a new topic. And at the time, I was assigned to TA a class in military history, which is something that I had no real background in. Military history is usually not taught. Very few academic historians specialize in the subject. And so I felt as though I had to do a lot of reading because I didn't want to look stupid in front of my undergraduates when they asked questions. And in particular, I read a lot about the First World War. And I noticed that basically everybody was drinking almost all the time, whenever they could. This was true in the British Army, in the French Army, and the German Army. And so I realized that I might have a topic here. I did some secondary reading and found that there was very little research done on this particular question. An article here, a couple of pages in a book there. So I went abroad to Europe on a scouting trip and found a wealth of material, particularly in the French military archives, that had to do with wine consumption. I found things like disciplinary reports, logistical records, discussions among commanders about what the ration should be set at. I found reports from an enological laboratory that tested all the wine to make sure it was good. And so I found a topic and was very lucky in doing so. Yeah.
And the topic was the word you just touched on, rationing, the rationing of wine for soldiers.
That's right.
That's bizarre. Can you talk a little bit about what that looked like in a day-to-day practice?
Sure. Well, of course, the fact that soldiers drink is not anything new. The Greeks did it. Medieval knights did it. But what made this French experiment with the wine ration so, I think, unique and important historically was the scale, the duration, and the rationale behind it. So the ration starts out relatively small. It's adopted in November of 1914, and it starts out at about a quarter liter per man per day. So not a ton, enough to get maybe a little bit of a buzz, but certainly not enough to get properly drunk on. But as the war stretches on, and the problem of maintaining morale in this huge conscript army, right, among people who really don't want to be there for the most part. But when they find themselves there in the trenches or at the front, they're essentially trapped, right? There's nowhere for them to go. They can't run away. And so this question of how to maintain morale, how to maintain a fighting spirit becomes incredibly pressing, particularly in the French case, because you have to remember the Germans are occupying this pretty significant sliver of northern France. And as the winter of 1914-1915 approaches, the French feel obligated for reasons of honor and strategy to go on the offensive, to drive the Germans out of France, retake France's territory, liberate it. And so this question of how to maintain high morale and fighting spirit in this very cold winter, the French army's not really equipped for it because everybody thought the war would be over quite quickly, becomes paramount. And there is this confluence of circumstances that leads to the army-wide adoption of a wine ration. So there's about 2.75 million soldiers in the French army on the Western Front. So everybody's getting a quarter liter of wine per man per day. It goes up to, in mid-1915, to half a liter. And in October 1917, towards the end of the war, to 3/4 of a liter per man per day. So a full bottle. So this is an enormous amount of wine and a huge logistical effort that not only sucks up wine, and in my book I call it a great big straw. I know I like that phrase too. I was kind of proud of it. Not only from France's traditional wine producing areas, but also in 1916, the army buys up the entire Iberian wine harvest. So from Spain and Portugal, they send purchasing agents to Argentina, where they find that it is way too expensive to ship wine across the Atlantic because of the U-boat threat. So the insurance cost is really high. They also talk about sending purchasing agents to California and Australia, although they don't. So the army's thirst for wine is basically unquenchable.
You mentioned morale as one of the key drivers for starting this practice, but also escalating it throughout the course of the war. Was there another aspect of it? I mean, because when I hear about alcohol given to soldiers, I think that's morale. But I come from a place where my mind comes to this place where we have to break you down to the part where you're comfortable killing. So I can't imagine drinking that much wine that I'd ever be able to I could kill this guy. But was there an element of that to it too?
Well, yes. That the idea was to, so I'll rephrase it. Morale functions essentially on two levels. Right, there's this micro level, which has to do with the day-to-day lives of soldiers, their interactions with each other, primarily on the squad level, right? So between the 10 and 12 soldiers with whom a given soldier will spend almost all their time, the guys they eat with, drink with, they share billets with, and the like. And so part of morale depends on what military historians typically call these primary group bonds. Right, you fight not necessarily for the big ideas behind the war, but you fight for your battle buddies, the people beside you. Then there's the kind of macro level, which has to do with the identification of the soldier with the nation, with the war aims more generally. And wine also serves an important role in these kind of micro-sociological dynamics, right? That it creates sociability, friendship, and the like. It bonds people together through the rituals of its consumption. But in the French case, too, because wine is taken to be essentially the symbol of France, right? It's the national drink, it's the blood of the soil, it's the sun made potable, and the like. Drinking it is supposed to bind these French soldiers to this bigger idea of France and French culture and French civilization. Interesting aside, in French, the way they use the term civilisation at the time refers specifically to France. France is civilization, and wine is this very important part of what it means to be French. And so it's not only a way to link people together on the ground, but also to create an almost spiritual connection to the imagined nation.
And that's something that was born during this time, right? Because I think we had talked earlier, and you said that France wasn't necessarily a wine culture, not like we know it to be today. This whole mechanism, these few years in the trenches, literally, kind of precipitated that, kind of created that France that we perceive of today. Yeah, yes, they did grow the wine and they did consume it, but as we get into it at another time, northern France was more into like more not fermented but distilled alcohol, a little harder, that's the kind of stuff you give someone to like kill, like, okay, all right, let's go, which one do I shoot? But that was kind of what we're seeing here, is like this is the birth of France as a wine nation, right?
Right. So France before the First World War has very powerful regional identities. In that people from the South think about themselves as Southerners, people from the North think about themselves as Northerners, and the like. And in the North, the traditional drinks are cider, beer, and eau de vie, which is distilled liquor primarily made from fruit. And so many people from the North have their first experience drinking wine on a daily basis when they're in the army. The army is this great amalgamation of French people from all over the country, right? And not everybody in the army even speaks French. People from the South speak a different language. And so the army serves as a way to kind of induct French citizens into this culture of wine drinking daily that was prominent in the wine growing areas, but not necessarily in the North. Right? And this is actually one of the reasons why the wine ration is adopted in the first place. Right? So not only is there this question of morale, which is one of the factors, but the other point is that the wine harvest of 1914 is a bumper. It comes in at, I think, 67 million hectoliters, the second largest on record. And then all the big consumers of wine, which is to say men between the ages of 19 and 45, are then locked away at the front. And so the winemakers find that their biggest consumers are not going to be able to purchase wine in the ordinary way. So they come up with the idea to have the army adopt this ration as a way of assuring their own profitability and solvency during the emergency of the war. They also believed that this would be a way to train French people to become daily wine drinkers. So essentially to get them hooked on wine and have them continue to drink it after the war ends. So it's a way of creating a market that will be sustained after the war as well. So they have that financial interest. Now, it doesn't actually work out for them necessarily because eventually the French state quasi-nationalizes the production of wine, with somewhere between a quarter and a third of everybody's wine harvest going to the army at set prices that are lower, substantially lower than the market prices would be. So they don't end up making off like bandits like they think they will. And the question of training wine drinkers for life is also somewhat flawed because it's premised upon people surviving the war. And not all of them do.
But if going back and looking at if it were a territorial Scrabble, and there are as you mentioned, highly regionalized, and each region has its own strong identity, which identity emerges to become more of the France that we know. It ends up being the one that's wine forward as opposed to the one that is distilled alcohol, which had its role. Distilled alcohol had its role in the course of a soldier's time on the front. But the France that emerged was that kind of like aspirational, like we're not just fighting to defeat an enemy, we're fighting to define our country that survives after this battle.
Right. And the wine consumption was a kind of a way for these French soldiers to quite literally feel patriotism in their body, right? It was a way to feel France running through their veins. So the fact that it's not bread that becomes the symbol, and it's not coffee, right? It's something that has real psychoactive effects. Real physical and physiological effects that make people, especially when they consume it together all at the same time, right, all feel the same kind of patriotic experience, which is why it's such a powerful tool for the army to unite people, to give them a common focus. And of course, the Germans are barbaric beer drinkers, which is why they're flaccid and uninspired and uncultured. So the fact that Germany has this beer drinking culture serves as a kind of perfect opposite in a sense, to the French wine drinking culture. Wine makes you witty. It's associated with French elan and elegance, whereas beer is this kind of, gross drink that is for the barbarians who live on, in the East.
Yeah, you can slosh a mug of beer and spill it all over people and not shed a tear. Try doing that with wine, and
every drop mattered.
Exactly
in the trenches. Yeah.
That's so fascinating. And you touched on very, very early in the conversation. It's not unique to have behavior altering chemistry, to introduce that into a soldier's life. You mentioned that alcohol had been back in Rome and such. There's also been a history before and after the First World War of other substances being used. And the things that come to mind, I know Germany during World War II did a lot of experimentation with methamphetamines. And I think that might be actually where the whole methamphetamine chemistry came from. That was a recipe that they developed to make their soldiers march faster and not need as much food and fight more vigorously, because I think it does kind of turn you into a crazy person. At least that's the image. But then we've got the CIA in the United States using like LSD and things. So it's not a foreign concept. This one just happened to really stick. Did you feel as you were researching this, like this is unique? It's not unique as a practice, but the results are unique in that this defined a country. Yes.
I thought that this was qualitatively and quantitatively different than what had come before. Like the practice of drinking alcohol among soldiers is not new, right? Like booze and soldiering have gone together since the beginning, basically, of time. Like the Egyptians and Babylonians paid soldiers in beer. But a couple of things change in the First World War. First is the nature of the fighting, the nature of battle itself. Up until the First World War, battles tend to be very short, right? A day, an afternoon in the case of ancient Greece, 2 or 3 days at the most in the case of the 19th century. But in World War I, you have battles that go on months. So the question of morale becomes something about a question of sustaining it, right? Not just getting it high for the moment of the attack, but sustaining it in these terrible conditions. The second thing that was really different was who was fighting, because the French army, as were all the armies on the Western Front as of 1916 or so, the British were not quite this way at the beginning. They had a professional army and eventually started with conscription, but the German and the French armies were almost all conscripts, right? Which is to say, probably mostly farmers who are brought from the countryside, given a uniform and a rifle, and then sent to the labyrinth of the trenches. And so, because they're not professionals, the question of how to maintain their morale becomes more pressing than it was before. And then I think the last thing is just the scale of it. That we're talking, again, almost 3 million men over the course of 4.5 years. The French army is drinking like a quarter of the world's production of wine, which is not that I was going to say not insignificant, but that's an awkward construction. It was a significant amount of wine. So the duration, the scale, and the like marked it off as something that I thought was unique. But in particular, too, the thing that marks it off as different than what came before, I think, was the rationale behind it. So it was not just about morale and about keeping the winemaker solvent, but it was also considered a kind of medical intervention, a biomedical intervention. For wine at this time in France is basically a panacea. Right? French scientists and doctors talk about how wine has unique biological properties, that it heals wounds, it's an antiseptic, it can make unpotable water drinkable, it has powerful electrical properties that recharge neurons in the brain. So the way this ration is conceived of by this kind of biomedical elite, and at the time in France, a pretty significant proportion of elected deputies are physicians. It's viewed as a biomedical intervention, as a way to optimize the soldier's body and mind so that they can essentially counteract the negative effects on the body and the mind of the trenches and the war more generally. And so you find this new rationale. I call it a form of psychotropic power of the state intentionally using a psychoactive drug in order to condition and drive certain kinds of behavior in a populace.
And that behavior is really born around creating unity, creating an us versus them. Like this is the functional us. We'll go to battle and we will vanquish. I come from a military family. My father served in combat. I have 4 brothers who all served. My sister served. One of my sisters served as a WAC. One of my sisters was a nurse in a military hospital. I'm the youngest of 7. I'm the only one that escaped military service. Thank you. But so I'm fairly well versed in it. And one of the things that always kind of bit into me as a young man, assuming that I was from the time I was born, this was my family. We went to battle. That's what we did. And I had assumed that it was going to come to me as well. So I got my mind around, basic training is like the training of being a soldier, which is, to be blunt, it's the erasure of everything that's happened to you up until that point. From the time we're born, we're told, don't hurt, Timmy, or hurting's bad, fighting's bad, don't fight. And then all of a sudden, within a couple of weeks, because there's a war on, let's break that down. You're a killer now. That's your new identity. You get comfortable in that skin because that's what's going to save you. That's what's going to defend the motherland or whatever. Do you see wine as being, or any chemical as being kind of I wouldn't say it would make you forget who you are, but could it further that as far as like behavior modification go? Because it make you more open to the suggestion of becoming a killer?
That's a very good question. So one way to think about the question is to realize that violence is hard to do. We have a comical understanding of the way violence works, mostly because of our exposure to war films and the like media that makes it appear as though every soldier on the battlefield is fighting bravely. Nobody ever runs away. Nobody ever has a breakdown. Nobody ever refuses to fire at the enemy. So there is this barrier of fear and tension and of socialization that needs to be overcome. And one of the roles that psychoactive drugs play in warfare, not just in the First World War, but more generally, is it provides a kind of moral distancing mechanism. That the feeling of intoxication is interpreted in the context of the fighting as the feeling of moral permission, right? The feeling of becoming something other than what you are in your peacetime self. So this helps to explain why such varied drugs can be used on the battlefield. Basically every army in history has had its drug of choice, right? Whether it be cannabis or opium, magic mushrooms, right? Drugs that don't lend themselves, at least in our popular understanding of them, to aggression. Mm-hmm. But yet people take them and benefit from them. And the way to explain this is to think about what alcohol researchers kind of awkwardly call non-pharmacological determinants of drug effects, something like that, which means the cultural expectations of what the intoxication means in a given context and what you're supposed to do with it. So one way to think about this in the context of the First World War is the consumption of distilled alcohol in the French army. The French army provides essentially what they call extraordinary distributions of distilled alcohol to soldiers before they attack. Not always, but from what I could tell, most of the time. And they typically get between about 4 ounces, some report 6 ounces of overproof eau de vie, so this industrially produced distilled alcohol, that they drink 15, 20 minutes before they go over the top. And so this is a kind of ritual, right? A morale aggression building ritual. And it works because of the way that distilled alcohol is coded in French society, I think, or is particularly effective because of this, that distilled alcohol is considered a uniquely dangerous and pernicious drug, the source of urban crime, prostitution, murder, and violence. And so when these soldiers drink this drink, which they've been told since they were young is profoundly dangerous, a very dangerous drug, they experience the intoxication as part of a process of overcoming their civilian hesitation toward violence. So I found a series of interviews with veterans that were done in the 70s and 80s, in which the interviewer asks everybody that he talked to, did you get alcohol before you attacked? And what was it like? And they almost all say things like, it turned me into a monster. It made me feel like a killer. I didn't know what I was doing. I was just enraged. I was a berserker. There's even, and this is fascinating, a rumor that spreads in the French army that they are not just receiving alcohol, but they're receiving alcohol mixed with ether to really dope them up. There's no evidence that this happens, and it's basically impossible considering the fact that ether's so volatile, and I don't know how you would even mix it, and people would definitely recognize the taste. But it goes to show that these men knew that their army, the state, was manipulating them, was trying to get them to act in a certain way by having them consume this drug in this particular context.
Like if we were to send soldiers, contemporary soldiers today, and say, here, take this meth and then go fight. They're going to think to their Breaking Bad, and they're going to say, I'm going to be Tuco Salamanca, and I'm going to charge out and I'm just going to start murdering people.
Similar to that, yeah.
Because that's the brand. That's
the brand, with exactly.
And so that was a 1-2 punch. And in one sense, they got a stronger, more aggressive fighter out of it because of the brand that existed with that alcohol to start with. But on the heels of that war, of the conflict, they were probably able to quiet down the any desire for that alcohol, for distilled alcohol, and replace it with a taste for wine, because that's what the country's about. The country's about love, moving forward, and unity and growing. So they replaced one brand for another, when essentially the alcohol itself just took you out of your head long enough to let that brand sink in and say, well, I'm going to be a this, or I'm going to be a crazy person, or I'm going to be a lover of my countrymen.
Yeah. And the thing too, to keep in mind is the nature of these First World War battles, which typically begin with a lengthy preparatory artillery barrage, right? The barrage is intended to kill and stun the enemy while he's in his trenches, so that when the attack begins, the attackers will be able to cross no man's land without really encountering any resistance at all. Right? By the time they get to the enemy trenches, the enemy will be stunned or dead, holed up in a dugout somewhere, and unable to defend themselves. So if the attack begins and these guys under the preparatory bombardment are relatively unscathed, they can come up and man their machine guns, the attack fails. So the thing to keep in mind is that even though these guys were kind of drunk, and this surely affected their fighting abilities, right? That with the motor degradation, perceptual changes, it really didn't matter all that much, because their job was to move across the land and take up space. Right? There's actually very little hand-to-hand bayonet crossing fighting that happens during the First World War. Almost all the casualties, the vast majority, something like 80%, are due to artillery fire. Then another 15 or so from machine guns and other small arms fire, and just a small sliver from actual hand-to-hand fighting. It's quite uncommon.
Yeah. And I'm thinking, like, with the ether, the introduction of ether, you're basically numbing people for, I'm going full Machiavelli here, but I'm saying, like, if you get hit with a bullet or some artillery fire along the way, yeah, just keep going. You know what I mean? Like, you're an animal, and you don't feel any pain. So let's just keep running. Very, very, manipulative, but all for the gain of the country. Is there any data that suggests that this approach, that
it's hard to say in a certain sense, but in their memoirs, their newspapers called trench journals, their letters, they talk about how they wouldn't have been able to win without alcohol. Both in the distilled alcohol before battle context and in the more general wine drinking in the trenches context. They in fact call wine by the end of the war the père de la victoire, the father of victory. And it is celebrated in post-war French culture, I guess interwar French culture, along with these great generals like Pétain, right? It is impossible to think about the experience or understand the experience of a French soldier in the First World War without taking into account the alcohol consumption.
You have artifacts here, right? These are actually from the battlefield.
These are dug up in a battlefield in northern France and purchased on a French eBay. Yeah.
Nice. What do we have?
So this is a canteen. It holds a liter. It's called the bidon. It has the mouth to drink from here and an aerating hole here. It made a very satisfying glug glug sound that soldiers would write about in their poems. It's sweet, petit glou glou. Soldiers would, in order to cheat the quartermaster and the wine cellars in the rear, because there was a kind of gray market in wine for people who were rotated out of the trenches during their days in rest. They would go to cafes, bars, even wine was sold out of windows and dog carts. And the way they would cheat would be firing a blank into one of these and would blow out the metal, so it would be more than a liter. This is the car, a quarter-liter cup. Some were tin, some were aluminum. So you would get 1, 2, or 3 of these worth of wine a day. And both the bidon and the car became essentially symbols of French soldiering. In trench journals, personal journals, soldiers are always drawing these things. They become, like symbols of the French soldier more generally. And you could see that in this little trinket here, which is one of my favorite things. These were little tchotchkes. On the inside of here, you can now see it's hollow, were pieces of paper, thin pieces of paper that would count down from 30 to 1. And you would give this to a soldier, a young Frenchman, 30 days before his birthday when he would join the army. So his 19th birthday. And he would be able to pull the things off one by one and do the countdown as though it were like an advent calendar. And when he got to the end, then he was a real man. He could go join the army, drink wine from his bidon. You can see there's a mini little cup there too. But this thing's really cool.
That's really, really cool. So does this replace a canteen? I mean, did they have water, or like this replace water?
So there was water, but people didn't like to drink it. There were problems with, obviously, like waterborne illnesses. Diarrhea in particular took out a significant amount of soldiers. So they preferred to drink wine because they knew it was safe. There were efforts, though, to provide chlorinated and sanitized water to people in the trenches. I found some information about these troughs that they used. But most of the water along the Western Front was quite evil, right? It soaked through the mud. There was all this debris, decaying biological matter. So it wasn't their favorite.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like microplastics of yore. Choose your weapon carefully. Yeah, because I mean, I again, being exposed to the military all through my childhood, canteens were like this was
their canteen.
Equipment. Yep. Yeah, that's pretty fascinating. I heard when you put that down, that's girthy. That's got some weight to it.
Yeah,
right? That's not.
And you have to imagine too. This is the way that the wine was carried up to the trench. The wine barrels would be unloaded basically at the mouth of the trench system. They'd be brought up on these little miniature railways. And then rations carriers leaving the frontline trenches would carry many of these bidons, like the bidon from their whole squadron, 10 or 12 of them, strapped on their back, walk all the way to the wine distribution point, fill themselves up, and then walk all the way back. So it was a physically laborious and often quite dangerous
Getting
process.
Your steps in.
Getting your steps in under fire too.
Yeah. I'm laughing. I know I shouldn't. It's not really funny, but it's fascinating to me. The whole thing is just so fascinating to me because so much came out of this one experiment. And this was, again, wine was not as ubiquitous in French culture at the time. Not on a national scale. And what the country became after the fact, almost as a result of this was like the birth of France as a wine leader. And yet, talk a little bit about the wine growing regions, because I think you mentioned that they were leaders in wine production, but just not consumption.
Well, so there's a couple of things that happen right in the last, I don't want to say the last half, maybe the last third of the 19th century in France, most important of which is the full development of transportation infrastructure. Right. So as of the end of the Franco-Prussian War, so 1871, basically the French rail system is built out. So it's possible to ship wine cheaply all throughout the country. Before that, the wine growing regions are islands separated from the rest of France, and wine is primarily a luxury drink. Most people drank water. But with the development of transportation infrastructure, with the development of new forms of mass media, particularly nationalized mass media where everybody's reading the same things, the same advertisements, wine grows in its popularity. The First World War, though, is really the moment, I think, when it becomes truly the national drink in practice. It's the national drink in legend, right, before, but ordinary people drinking wine every day, from all over the country, it happens after the First World War.
Did it have any impact on PTSD?
So that's a good question. Well, PTSD as a concept doesn't exist at the time, right? There is shell shock, neurasthenia is another kind of umbrella diagnosis of nervous disorders. Hysteria, there's debates about whether hysteria can be experienced by men, for instance, in the First World War. The French have a syndrome they call obésité, which means essentially shell-itis, or the shell illness, which is the equivalent of shell shock. And there is a belief that alcohol can cure this, or at least address some of the symptoms. So yes, to some degree.
Okay. So, well, that's kind of fascinating in and of itself. Do you think that that's kind of mind over matter? Mind over matter? Is it more power of suggestion, or is there actually like a physical relief, do you think, that comes from the alcohol?
I think there's probably a physical relief, right? Alcohol has these anxiolytic properties, right? It relieves anxiety, but it's probably mostly, again, what the drug people would call the non-pharmacological drug effect of the drink.
Gotcha. Okay. That's fascinating. I wish we had more data scientists available back then to actually track these things. But so how have you seen this scenario played out because of its success in France during World War I? Have you seen this kind of played out on a larger scale, like adopted by militaries throughout the world?
In a certain way, yes. That's not to say that the use of psychoactive drugs in militaries post World War I was directly influenced or patterned after the French experience during that war, but rather that the same kind of logic applies in the Second World War, in wars in Indochina and Vietnam, the global war on terror, the Soviet experience in Afghanistan. All of these are associated with drug use to one degree or another. An interesting example is the French experience in the the First Indochina War. Right, the decisive battle of that war takes place in 1954 at Dien Bien Phu, this kind of valley. The French go into the valley. They get surrounded by Viet Minh soldiers, are getting shelled, and the only way they can resupply themselves is by airdrop. And so the French Air Force airdrops 2 drugs to these soldiers. They airdrop amphetamines, Maxitone is the French trade name, and they also airdrop something called Vino Gel, which is a dehydrated wine product. You mix it in a ratio of 3 ounces of water to every ounce of Vino Gel, and it produces a passable red wine at about 10 or 11% alcohol by volume. Wow. So they would actually airdrop these crates of Vino Gel into the battlefield at Dien Bien Phu. And some veterans reported that there were engagements that were fought over these crates of Vino Gel when they landed in no man's land.
Does that still exist? Does Vino Gel still exist?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure.
Man. Oh, that would be that's a war as hell. But, you know.
I find that to be just extremely French.
Yeah. Our best scientists are working on a way to deconstruct wine so that you can reanimate it at like twice its alcohol volume. That's a higher volume of alcohol?
10-11% is about average for the time. Now you go to the store, usually they're from 12 to 14%, so a little bit more alcoholic.
Interesting. It explains a lot of family fights too. What did we miss? Is there anything that we didn't talk about that you really want America, the podcast world, to know?
Well, there are these series of mutinies that take place in the French army in the spring and early summer of 1917, following a particularly disastrous offensive, the Second Battle of the Aisne, or the Nivelle Offensive, as it's known in the historiography, begins in mid-April of 1917. The commander in charge at the time, a guy named Robert Nivelle, promises France's soldiers that this is the last battle, the last push, that he says, I have the formula for victory. And they get massacred during the attack. And morale plummets. And about a month after the attack begins, French soldiers begin to refuse orders to remount the trenches and attack again. So there's this series of rebellions. Historians debate whether they should be properly characterized as strikes, manifestation, or as mutinies, rebellions, or what to call them, essentially. But in any case, these guys refuse to go up. And in quite a few cases, these mutinies begin in wine shops, which is to say they involve intoxicated people. And so what I argue in my book is that essentially the army loses control of this alcohol-based system to keep morale high in the context of this one particularly disastrous offensive. And also there's a terrible harvest over that, or a terrible harvest on the horizon anyway, because the winter of 1916-17 is particularly cold. There's the example of the Russian Revolution, at least the first part of the Russian Revolution, which takes place in March 1917. And this whole elaborate system of trying to generate certain kinds of behaviors, patriotic behaviors, to bring people together, gets turned on its head. And soldiers use this very tool that had been used to control them to unify and face down their own commanders.
Wow. So did that have any lasting impact? I mean, I can't imagine that France would have let word of that get spread very far. That becomes the baseline behavior. But did it inform fighting moving forward?
Yes. So a couple of things happen as a result of this. First, there's repression. People are executed. There are some units that are completely disbanded, broken apart. Their soldiers reintegrated into other units. There are people who are put on trial, put in prison. One guy, a famous soldier named Vincent Moulia, is in prison, about to be put on trial and probably executed for his his participation in what were euphemized as acts of collective indiscipline. When a German shell hits his prison, kills the guards, and rips a hole in the wall, and he runs out and escapes to Spain, where he lives all through the 1930s until the Spanish Civil War breaks out. But the main effects are basically three. That a new commander, Henri Philippe Pétain, takes over. He promises an end to wasteful offensives. He promises better food and better rest, and he raises the wine ration, while at the same time restricting the amount of wine that people can drink outside of the official army rations. So there is a kind of doubling down on both wine as a tool, but also the control of consumption. The goal is to make sure that soldiers only drink what wine the army gives them when the army gives it to them.
So does France still use this today for their military?
Not anymore,
okay,
to my knowledge. But there was a wine ration until relatively recently.
And how relatively recently?
I want to say it was in the 90s. But
okay.
I'm not 100% sure off the top of my head.
Okay, so that's
don't quote me on that, but I guess I am going to be quoted on it, right?
Yeah, we'll fact check after the fact. But that's fascinating to think that it's that recent, something that was kind of born in the early 1900s. Wow, that's incredible.
Well, it's kind of like the rum ration in the Royal Navy, right? It's a part of the culture. It's a part of what it means to be an RN sailor.
That's pretty fascinating. Yeah, I wonder what our soldiers are doing these days. But
lots of caffeine,
caffeine
and vapes.
Yeah, I bet. That's real. That's very cool.
Yeah, the drug of choice for American soldiers and Marines during the global war on terror were these super concentrated energy drinks, kind of like the 5-hour energy things. They had names like they were called Rip It or Rip Fuel.
Okay.
Wild Tiger. And so they would consume a ton of those things when they went out on patrol. That checks out.
Yeah, that's pretty consistent with Hollywood. Hollywood portrays that, I would imagine, fairly accurately, and I can hear the music playing behind their consumption of it too, and as they take off, and it's not Wagner's Flight of the Valkyries.
No.
All right. Well, this has been really educational and fun for War Talk.
Thank you.
Very informative. I really appreciate you stopping by. Special thanks to today's guest, Adam Zientek. If you'd like to learn more about Adam's work, check out our YouTube page for links to his bio, books, articles, research, and more. And thank you for joining Minds Over Matters today. You can find us on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. Please subscribe, share with your friends, and spread the word. We have a lot to say, and we guarantee something for everyone. Minds Over Matters is hosted by Ed Kiggins, produced by the College of Letters and Science at UC Davis, and filmed in the Larry Chandler Memorial Studio. Thank you for listening. We'll see you next time.